Good evening and welcome to Helping Kids Heal from Trauma and Manage Stress. My name is Chelsea Prox and I am the Director of Children's Health and Wellbeing at the American Federation of Teachers. I'll be moderating tonight's webinar. Tonight I am thrilled to welcome our presenters. We have a few experts. First we have Julie Schellberg, Superintendent for Ridgeland School District 122 in Illinois and part of the Partnership for Resilience. From Futures Without Violence, we have Casey Corcoran and Jasenia Gorbia. And from the National Math Foundation, we have Kara Battaglia. And I'll invite you to check out their bios in your slides as well. I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to Kara to get us started on trauma and learning.
Thank you, Chelsea. I think that many of us recognize that repeated trauma wreaks havoc on a child's ability to learn, on their ability to regulate their emotions, to pay attention, to form social relationships with peers and authority figures, all of which makes it difficult for a child to learn in a school environment. Now, many children have learned healthy responses to stress since infancy. A baby cries and we soothe or cuddle or swaddle or rock or sing to it or feed it in response to that cry. So many children have positive interactions with caring adults early on, and that builds the foundation for healthy brain development. And learning to cope with adversity is part of normal childhood development. When the stress hormones are triggered, there is generally a response from a supportive adult in a healthy childhood. And the effects of stress that they experience is buffered and naturally brought back down to a baseline. But when we have children who experience long-term impact of high stress, stress that is powerful, frequent, prolonged, or unpredictable without adequate adult support, then that child's stress response system remains on at all times. This high level of stress disrupts the development of the brain and increases the risk for learning difficulties, social outcomes, poor health. Some of you may or may not be familiar with the ACEs study, which is a large-scale ongoing evaluation examining the link between childhood trauma and health issues well into adulthood. And with the ACEs or experiences that the children have, the number of trauma occurrences is more important than the severity of them. But it's the child's interpretation of a fearful situation that is more likely to trigger a response, whether that's conscious or subconscious. And it's important to understand that complex trauma is not just abuse. Children that are in under-resourced homes develop post-trauma difficulties after experiencing complex trauma. Those under-resourced homes may be where domestic or neighborhood violence occurs, racial discrimination, poverty. And the impaired system results in a highly sensitive reactive survival instinct. So let's talk a little bit about what trauma is. There's all types of trauma and trauma events. And if a child can't predict where, when, or how much stress they're going to experience at any given time, their brains and bodies become hardwired to react with fight, flight, or fear. These repeated exposure to ACEs and triggers of the trauma response lead to these challenges that we're seeing in schools. What is experienced as trauma is personal and is influenced by our past experiences and relationships and our community. So in the absence of that buffering protection afforded by stable, responsive relationships in a healthy household, we see toxic stress and inability to buffer and respond to all types of trauma, whether that's abuse or whether that's economic hardship, a loss of job, a loss of a loved one, incarceration, anything like that. And it's important also to identify that trauma is identifying trauma is one thing, but recognizing and responding to its effects is another. So let's take a minute to answer our first poll question here. Which factor is most likely to trigger a traumatic response in a child? The severity of the experience, the frequency, the duration, or the interpretation of the experience? Just take a minute to enter your response by clicking on the button. So it's actually the interpretation of the experience that is the correct answer. It's not what happened to these children or when it happened. It's a physical, emotional, and psychological response that rewired their brain and is not even happening at a conscious level. So, for example, a child who has reactive attachment disorder may not have it with their adoptive parents, but may have trust issues in the teachers of the school being able to protect them in a scary situation like a fire drill. So it's actually the child's interpretation of whether or not the experience is affecting their fight, flight, or freeze response that is the correct answer there. So let's talk a little bit about the trauma response. When something non-threatening happens that reminds a trauma-impacted student of an incident, her body replays a hardwired reaction. No matter which option the student outwardly displays, the body simultaneously shuts down the systems for thinking and reasoning. When used repeatedly, these students actually become more easily triggered because their bodies never have time to recover. So the more it happens, the more it will happen in many cases with these children. And when we talk about that hardwired response, this is what happens when we have a behavioral situation in the school and we say to the children, why did you do that? And their response is, I don't know. Well, they're honestly answering you. They really don't know. It's an instinctive fight, flight, or freeze, not a conscious response when they're having that reaction. So they're actually answering you pretty honestly. It's also not a linear process. And the best description I've ever heard of the effects of complex trauma is to liken it to a vinyl record. When a song is played again and again and a groove is worn into that record and someone accidentally bumps into the record player and the needle skips across the record and lands in the deepest groove and replays it again, even when you reach the end of the song, sometimes the groove is so deep that the needle skips back to play it again. And like that needle on a record player, complex trauma wears a groove in the traumatized child's brain, so that when something non-threatening happens that reminds a student of a traumatic incident, their body replays the traumatic reaction, mobilizing the fight, flight, or freeze response, and shutting down the systems that actually help them to think and reason. And if this happens over and over again, they become more easily triggered into that response mode, and their bodies and brains don't have a chance to recover from that. So it's important to understand here that what you perceive as non-threatening is not necessarily non-threatening to these children. A schedule change, a transition from lunch back to the classroom, a fire drill, a substitute teacher, anything that creates that, uh-oh, what's going to happen next feeling in these children can actually trigger the trauma response. And anytime a child can't predict where, when, and how much stress they'll experience, it may trigger the trauma response. So their ability to respond and recover from stress is what actually becomes impaired. And it's also important to understand that these triggers are usually invisible and their reactions are often delayed, which is why it can be very confusing for teachers. Sometimes their behavior makes absolutely no sense at all because we as teachers look and say, but nothing happened to trigger that. And in reality, that trigger may have happened much earlier in the day or even at home before the child came to school or the night before the child came to school. And the child's been carrying it inside, and it's built and built and built. So that can be a bit of a challenge. So in the chat box, I'd like you to share what you think the behaviors in the classroom are that you suspect might be a typical symptom of trauma. Just go ahead and type it right into the chat box. Anger, bullying, talking out, throwing objects, hitting others, verbally abusing others, becoming aggressive, disengagement. You know, it's interesting because we're pretty quick to label students nowadays. And the interesting thing is that many trauma-related symptoms actually mimic ADHD, autism, Asperger's syndrome, oppositional defiant disorder, or OCD. And there's actually quite a bit of overlap in the same symptoms manifesting themselves. And what I have learned is that if the behavior is environment specific and school is a minefield for these kids, then it's a trauma response and not a medical diagnosis. I don't want to confuse behavioral, in the comments, I don't want to confuse behavioral issues or social emotional issues with trauma. It can be much more subtle than that. I mean, yes, those can be some of the behaviors, but let's talk really quickly about spotting trauma. Because these kids are going to have good days and bad days, and the important thing is to recognize their behaviors come from fear and safety issues. You don't need to know their ACE score. You don't need to know their personal history to identify the social and emotional support they need. But the trigger can be something as simple as a student pushing them on the bus at 8 o'clock in the morning. And in music class in the afternoon, that's been festering all day, and they suddenly have an emotional explosion. So let's go back to those symptoms I was talking about, because a lot of times it can be as simple as lack of eye contact, no regard for boundaries, a lack of healthy relationships with peers or teachers, not responding to reward systems, refusal to work, disobedience, trouble focusing, clenching their fists, bursting into tears, not reacting with any expression or having the deer in the headlights reaction. So I think it's important to understand that very often we're not recognizing that there was a trauma history that's creating these symptoms. And again, in my experience, very often if the children are reacting that way specifically in the classroom environment or the school environment, that's a huge sign that some of these symptoms are more reflective of a trauma history than they are of some of the other things that we tend to label them as. And we need to understand that before we can respond to it. So I'm going to wrap this up and pass it on to Chelsea now so that we can move on with the presentation.
Thanks so much, Kara. That was a wonderful introduction. I want to turn it over to our friends at Futures Without Violence, Jasenia and then Casey, to really help us think about the day-to-day practices school personnel can adopt that would prevent trauma triggers, that would keep kids from getting into some of these tricky scenarios, and additionally, the day-to-day practices that we can use to help students build resilience. And if they are triggered, how do we return them to a learning brain? How do we sort of get them back online? So we'll start off with Jasenia.
Fantastic. Thank you, Chelsea. So with that, we're going to present to you a Changing Minds, one of our campaigns that specifically addresses day-to-day practices that school personnel can adopt to prevent trauma triggers, as well as ways that we can help build resilience and return to a learning brain. So Changing Minds is a partnership between Futures Without Violence and the Ad Council, as well as our chief supporter in this work, the U.S. Department of Justice. Our partners at the Ad Council helped us secure the communications and creative agency Wonderman to be a partner in our work. Through the Office on Juvenile Justice and Delinquency Prevention, the Changing Minds campaigns actually falls under the Defending Childhood banner, which is an initiative that was launched in 2010 by the Attorney General Eric Holder, to address a national crisis, which you all are familiar with, which is the exposure of America's children to violence as victims and as witnesses. The program, which has operated in 8 sites throughout the country, develops strategic plans for comprehensive community-based efforts that will further demonstrate the goals of this initiative. This campaign goes as a complement to that initiative, to the Defending Childhood initiative. Speaking to building resilience, we know that as a result of various research studies, such as the work of Jack Shonkoff, a distinguished professor of pediatrics and child development and the director of the Center on the Developing Child at Harvard University, we know that a caring and consistent adult in a life of a child can help a child build resilience in the face of trauma. And that's what this campaign is about, connecting the dots between what we're seeing above the surface, as Kara spoke to, and assessing what's going on more deeply, and then coming up with more effective responses and solutions to help young people thrive and succeed. And so with that, our campaign's objective is around raising awareness of the prevalence of this issue, building urgency, and educating on the impact of children's exposure to violence and the solutions to childhood trauma. So the question is, how do we actually motivate adults who interact with youth to utilize everyday gestures to impact the kids in their lives? With the research, Wonderman developed the campaign strategy, which guided the creative development. The strategy focused on the idea that through small but important gestures, a caring, consistent adult could help kids heal from the effects of trauma. I want to speak to the gestures that we created. The gestures of our campaign promote and are based on conversations we conducted and existing research. These gestures that you see here will be referenced and explained and encouraged throughout the campaign site and some of the campaign elements as well. These gestures are, as you can see in the slides, celebrate them, which is to say, to use put-ups and not put-downs, and tell them what you like about them. Comfort them. Stay calm and patient. Refrain from reactive or raising your voice. Also listen to them. Show interest in their passions. Be present when they're talking. We also recognize that it's important to collaborate with children, ask them for their opinions, and help them to work through their problems. And last, we also know to inspire children, to expose them to new ideas, to help them see a brighter future. In this campaign, we also have included resources if you're concerned that a child needs more intensive intervention and referral, so that's something to pay attention to, as well as tools for adults to take care of themselves in response to their own experiences of trauma. We know that trauma can change a kid's mind, but your everyday gestures can help them heal, and we have that exemplified here in the a traumatized brain versus a healed brain, and we want to move from a trauma experience of trauma to healing a child's brain over time, which we know is supported by the science. of a caring, consistent adult. And you may have heard of this reframing before about not asking what's wrong with you, but actually what happened to you. This idea is being illustrated by the graphic here of the hurt brain as well as the healed brain, which will be carried throughout all of the creative elements. These concepts and visuals were tested with our target audience, such as educators like yourself, and seemed to be really motivating and inspirational for that group. We wanted to clearly communicate the physical impact of both trauma and the healing gestures. And to return to the campaign's background premise, we recognize that too often childhood trauma is misdiagnosed and misunderstood, as Karis spoke to. Because on the outside, we know that the victims of childhood trauma look like just regular kids, but on the inside, these kids have been affected emotionally, mentally, and even physically, so much so that their brain development can actually be affected and changed. So let's start by changing it back. Caring, consistent adults, such as yourself, can literally help kids change their minds about childhood trauma. Now we want to hear from you. In the group chat, please tell us, what are your everyday gestures for building healthy relationships and healing relationships with students? Great, complimenting them for the work that they're doing. Definitely in the celebrate section, encouraging them every morning. That's definitely an inspire, as well as staying at their level and listening, giving them credit for their efforts. Always greet them by name and smile when I see them. Recognizing that a child is there and that you know that they're there is a really critical piece of engaging with that child and helping them heal. Great. All of these are really fantastic. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Casey to talk more about leadership development and how to include this on a larger scale in school system.
Hi, everybody. I'm joining you from snowy Boston, and I love reading the group chat comments. I want to be, I wish I was in your classrooms growing up. These are some great recommendations and things that you're already doing in your classroom. So as my colleague Jasenia said, we have this large campaign called Changing Minds that has multiple pieces to it. It's really an ecosystem. And it includes the public education campaign work, but it also includes our Changing Mind Institute that was developed for educators in the school community to really do the on-the-ground work, to build the knowledge, to build the skills, to build the opportunities for schools in this larger school community to practice these skills. And what it was developed out of the Office of Juvenile Justice and Delinquency and Prevention as well in the Department of Justice. We pulled together national experts like yourself to talk about what school personnel need. And one thing we kept hearing was that we need the skills, we need the knowledge, but we also need to build leadership. And what we did was we worked with folks to develop a 2-day national institute where a school would send a multidisciplinary team, so that could be school staff, that could be a public safety officer, it could be a counselor, an administrator, a parent leader, to get trained up on best practices in the field around healing from trauma, race and gender equity and intersectionality, so the best practices in social emotional learning, SEL, positive school discipline, and then take some concrete steps around action planning. So when these multidisciplinary teams come to these 2-day institutes, which we piloted and had very successful institutes in both Memphis, Tennessee, and Portland, Oregon this past fall, we asked them to work together as a team to develop an action plan around these critical issues to identify gaps, to identify strengths in their school, so that when they go back, they can meet with their larger school team and work on these areas that need to be strengthened and celebrate the areas that they're really doing a fantastic job. And we provide training and TA support throughout the year to these schools, so we're not just saying goodbye at the end of the 2 days. And really the goal of that is to give real on-the-ground concrete strategies. Jasenia talked about the gestures as part of the campaign. There are things we can do. You know, we don't all have to be clinicians, and sometimes people get scared away. When we create safe and nurturing school environments, we're really helping students stay focused on their learning, and we're creating healthier kids, and we're creating healthier school environments and healthier staff. And one of the things that we can do is establish shared values and goals. I used to be a second grade teacher, and I remember a veteran teacher said to me, you know, you spend your first month, or maybe more than a month, on classroom management, and then you get to teach the rest of the year. And what I found was that when I spent the first month building the shared values, goals, and expectations in my classroom, I was much more effective throughout the year because my kids knew what to expect. There was structure, there was predictability. They knew how I was going to respond. Now, when I was a first-year teacher, I wasn't particularly good at this, but I got better. So creating those creating a more predictable environment for students, from everything from how you greet them in the morning to what time you do stations to what time you go to lunch, having them be in the know creates a safer environment for them. It also includes expectations about how you're going to communicate with them. Those are gestures that make a huge impact. They know what to expect from you. And when we do these sorts of things, what we allow them is to return to the learning brain. Our brain is reactive, and in that trauma state, that fight or flight, it's very difficult to learn. I had young people in my classroom who had witnessed violence at home in the morning or couldn't leave for school because there had been a fight in front of their building. And they had experienced a traumatic experience before they came into school, and it was very hard for them to focus on their morning journal writing. They needed to get regulated first. And as educators, we need to recognize these triggers. We need to recognize when things are going on with students. And when we see those triggers, when we see that a student is dysregulated in our class, there are things we can do. One is to give them options. Talk to them about appropriate behaviors and give them options about how to get self-regulated again, whether it's reading a book, whether it's putting their head down, whatever works for you in your classroom and what works for that kid. When you give them options and when they know what to expect, you're giving them some control and you're giving them some decision-making power as well. And we also want to celebrate when they're successful, when they're having good days, when their strategies are working. I know it was always better. I always made sure to tell students when they were doing a great job, and I always made sure to tell parents when kids were doing a great job in my class, because that opened up lines of communication. They knew that I wanted to celebrate their child. I wasn't looking just to punish them. And that created more open and honest dialogue, and I was able to better serve those students that were in my classroom. You can also use I statements. This is a big part of social emotional learning. I see that you're upset. Your face you look like you're angry, or it seems like you're angry. Using I statements, not prejudging, can be an effective strategy. And one thing I would add is that we did, Futures Without Violence did a number of focus groups in California over the past year where we talked to high school students about these issues, about how trauma makes its way into the classroom. And a critical question that we asked them was, who are the kids that we're missing? And to a student, they said, the quiet kids or the kids that are getting good grades in class. Because don't mistake getting good grades for that everything is all right with them, either at home or in their community, or they talked about their dating relationships or if there's relationship violence. So we can't the squeaky wheel gets the oil, but we can't overlook those quiet kids. And when we create these safe and supportive environments and trusting environments and predictable environments, we're going to be more likely to notice any of the kids in our classroom who are having problems. We're going to do a poll now, and I'd like to give people about 30 seconds to answer, or it's a quiz actually, more than a poll. I can create a safe, trauma-informed environment by letting students make mistakes and learn from them, picking my battles, keeping students on their toes with surprises and instruction and activities, and constantly correcting them. So please take a minute and click and then submit. All right, we're going to see how folks answered. All right. Winner far and away was letting students make mistakes and learn from them, with picking my battles as a runner-up. I think I was an expert in picking my battles when I was teaching. The best answer here is letting students make mistakes and learn from them. Young people learn from mistakes. Adults learn from mistakes. But we need to create those safety nets, those supportive environments where those mistakes can be learning opportunities and they can be safe, instead of having them keep falling. We need to bring them back up and lift them back up, because we want them to challenge themselves. We want them to set high goals, but we need to create those safe and supportive learning environments through many of the simple gestures that my colleague Jasenia talked about. With that, I'm going to turn it back over to Chelsea.
Thanks so much, Casey. I'm delighted to sort of reflect one more time on what we just heard, which was really starting to think about, with changing minds, how individual practice can start to make us trauma-informed. And as Casey began to add, how do we really build trauma-informed systems as well? When we're looking beyond individual classrooms or the cafeteria or the playground or the bus, how do we make an entire system, like a school district, adopt a trauma-informed approach? So I'm going to turn it over to Julie Schellberg to talk about how she's really adopted a number of these strategies in her district, and in addition, how she's really built in staff care.
Okay, thank you, Chelsea. Julie Schellberg here from the south side of the city of Chicago. We're actually a south suburb. Our school district is Ridgeland 122. And for us, creating a trauma-informed system started with a partnership with Governor State University and their Teacher Quality Program grant. Based on this work, we started with the university. We set a course for the district entitled it Challenge Plus Care Equals Success. This was based on the research of Dr. Joseph Murphy from Vanderbilt University and his book, Creating Positive Cultures in School. Dr. Murphy talks about two walls of data in his book, the academic data and the social-emotional data. For us, the challenge is the academic side of the student's educational experiences, with the goal for us of lifting all students to their fullest potential. And the care is the emotional side of education, with the idea that if you promote both, you will achieve success. So that's kind of what led us to where we are today. From that TQP grant, the Partnership for Resilience evolved, and the ACEs research was brought to the forefront, and that research has impacted how we approach students in School District 122. It just so happens that in Illinois, Audrey Soglin, who is the Illinois Education Association Executive Officer, and her brother, Dr. David Soglin, put their heads together just within their own little family and worked with the partnership to move this initiative forward. They're working to acknowledge that all educators and the medical field need to work and partner on behalf of students and families experiencing trauma and toxic stress. So the Partnership for Resilience was developed in the Southland of Chicago as a vehicle to assist school districts with locating and securing services and supports for our students. The partnership is made up of a diverse group of individuals and organizations that come from the medical and health field, universities, labor, teacher unions, and school systems. For us, becoming part of this organization opened the door to partner with local agencies to secure services for our students in the area of health, dental, vision, and behavioral health. In the Southland, working with different agencies, we determined that our biggest need and the one that's most difficult for us to fulfill is the need for mental health support. This has been a real challenge in our area. Just even securing psychiatrists has been very difficult for us. So what the partnership has helped us do is to have on-site vision, dental, and the Ronald McDonald Health Mobile come to our neediest population and service our students and families. And this has truly made a great difference in their lives and in their ability to maintain attendance and perform in school. Most recently, because of our partnership, I have 3 staff members from my district that are in the process of becoming accredited in the PPP, Positive Parenting Program System, which is a system that we will use to train and engage parents and help them understand how to work with their children in school. The partnership is currently working on ways to expand their services to other districts, but right now, as a group, we're really focusing on quality and not quantity. We want to make sure it's successful with a smaller group of students and school districts before we move it on to others. They're working with 5 districts right now, high school and elementary districts, and my district in particular is preschool to grade 8. Okay, with the support of the partnership, our district took the first step in becoming a trauma-informed system. We developed a resiliency team. Our team consists of teacher leaders, union representation. We have a social worker, a psychologist, and administration on our team. We participated in a 4-day training and at Governor State University where we devised a plan on how we were going to implement and roll out the trauma-informed practices. Once our team was trained, we took a motion to our Board of Education and had them approve it. So just really securing that it was going to be an entire district that was going to be in agreement and moving forward with this initiative. Our team decided to make this a 2-year rollout. What we have found in our district that slow and steady wins the game. If we try to roll everything out at one time and quickly, it's very difficult for us to sustain this. So for sustainability, we've learned the lesson several times that we need to roll it out slowly and do it well, and then we are better able to sustain what we do. So year 1 for us has been about professional development, and that includes training our staff on the ACEs research, trauma, its impact, and becoming a trauma-informed system, and what exactly does that mean? Part of that is we selected a social-emotional learning curriculum, second step, which is very strong yet manageable, and it is a curriculum that is pretty much scripted for our teachers. They have about 1 day a week that every classroom does one lesson, and the teachers have found it to be very powerful and very manageable because then with that lesson they can thread that throughout other things throughout the week. So there's basically 1 lesson a week on social emotional learning. As part of the initiative, and also based on the work of Dr. Joseph Murphy, our teams have been working on improving parent engagement to give our students and their families a sense of belonging and membership. We do things like, really look out for parent input when we're trying to do something new in our school, or even with textbook selections. We've developed parent organizations for our EL, our English language learning students, for our special education student parents, and just really inviting them not only to come to the after-school activities where there's fun things going on, but also working to have them in the classrooms during curricular time to get them engaged in what's happening in the classroom on a daily basis. In year 2, we plan to include professional development and training on the strategies that will be used in the classroom, and those will include restorative justice strategies as well. We will continue to focus on toxic stress and the impacts on executive functioning. So we'll be ending this school year with information for our teachers on what exactly executive functioning is, how it works, and then how stress impacts that. We just believe that our teachers having a great understanding and a deep understanding of toxic stress and ACEs research will help them better manage the strategies in the classroom. I have included in your toolkit that you'll have access to a list of all of the way that we rolled out this implementation this school year. Once a month we have a topic that's discussed at a Tuesday morning meeting, and that's been very powerful. We give the teachers either a video to watch or an article to read, and they have to be prepared when they come in for this 30-minute meeting, and the meetings are very effective and they're run very well so that we can get to the point and have good professional conversation on what we can do to help our students. So there's some video links in there, there's some articles and some activities that you might want to look at and maybe take back to your district to maybe consider rolling out an initiative such as this. The emphasis has been on helping teachers change their mindset from what is wrong with the struggling student to what has happened to the student. Keeping in mind that we don't know every child's story, we want our staff to assume that every child has ACEs. When we talk about our students now, we talk about their ACE score, and we work to understand how this is impacting the child and their family. We are also selectively sharing some details with teachers that maybe we wouldn't have shared in the past regarding students, their needs, and their past experiences. So right now there is a poll question I'd like you to answer. Which of the following is not a key element of a trauma-informed systems change? Fostering positive school discipline, build staff and faculty capacity for new activities with training, replace programs like PBIS, RTI, and restorative justice, create school culture of belonging, including for families. Okay, replacing programs like PBIS and RTI and restorative justice. I think this is a smart group. Very good. Okay, so there's your answer. All right. The last piece of the puzzle for our team, and we felt that this was crucial, and we decided to include in our implementation was staff care. This has taken our initiative to another level. Research tells us that secondhand toxic stress can be unhealthy and exhausting. So if we're asking our staff to take on students' trauma and help the students manage their stress, then we all agreed that we need to do something for our staff. The first step was to acknowledge that although we find this essential, we realize that it can be stressful. We provide opportunities for release and conversation. The district team and the building level teams themselves have taken on the job of acknowledging and celebrating the work and success of their colleagues. Our approach has been that as adults, we may also have ACEs. We encourage our staff to take care of their physical and mental health, to care for themselves and each other. The goal is to grow positive culture and carry these examples into the classroom. You know, we stress to our students that, we stress to our staff that students are watching what you're doing, and they're watching your interactions with each other, and those are great examples and great ways for them to learn how to also interact. Some of the things that the teachers have done are just set up brag boards, realize when someone's having a bad day or a good day, and then support them through that day. Putting luncheons together, book clubs, staff member of the week, shout-outs, sharing, and really most of all listening to each other and just showing that the administration listens to the teachers listen to the administration, and take that down to our parents and students. So staff care has really been a crucial part of this. The teachers are really enjoying it. Everybody loves to be acknowledged, and you know, and by us acknowledging them and their needs, we're hoping that they will acknowledge their students and their family needs. And it has really, so far, has been a really great experience for our district. So with that said, there is another chat box. We'd like you to take a minute to share how does your employer support staff care, or what would you like to see your employer adopt for staff care? So we have answers like, I think we should encourage more parent engagement. Parent-friendly workplaces are great. Okay, I'm going to turn this back over to Chelsea.
Thanks, Julie. It looks like we still have a few answers trickling in, so I'll take a moment to go through those and also encourage folks to put things into the Q&A box. If any questions came up during this session, we'd love to hear from you so that we can really tap into our expert panel and try to get them. For the moment, I'm going to go back and really try to look closely at what some of your employers are doing or what you'd like to see for staff care. I see a weekly meeting to discuss things that staff have been sort of struggling with, being called out for positive behaviors, ideas for stress management, warm and friendly environments, luncheons, connections with parents, communication and acknowledgement. So I'm hearing some of the things that Julie was saying, which are fantastic, and we love to hear that. I'm going to turn it over now into our question section. And I'm going to turn this question over to everyone, but I'm going to ask for, let's see, I'm going to ask for Kara to start with this one. How do you share details about students that you normally would not necessarily share without violating confidentiality? So especially when we're thinking about health sensitive information, how can we be sharing useful information, making informed decisions about our students, but not violating confidentiality? And again, I'm going to start with Kara.
Sharing them with who? I'm a little confused about the question.
Good question. I think that this references sharing with your colleagues, but if Michelle, who asked this question, wants to chime in, that'd be helpful too. She can plop it in the group chat for us.
You know, I don't think that it's as much an issue. I don't think you need to know the details of what happened to the child. You know, as we said, the frequency of ACEs, the number of ACEs that they have, and the child's interpretation of certain experiences or environments or threats are really the best way we can deal with that. It's not really a matter of knowing exactly what type of abuse they experience. And I'm going to give you a personal example. I adopted a child who had all 10 ACEs by the age of 1. And that child doesn't have a conscious memory, but he has severe trauma reactions based on what happened to him. So it's not really an issue. Once he got in school, it was identified as PTSD, anxiety, all related to early neglect and abuse. But his teachers don't need to know or share what exactly happened to him. They need to know that he has a trauma reaction and not, say, autism, which it was originally confused as. So I don't know that those details need to be shared.
Thank you for that. And Julie, I want to maybe turn this question to you as well. You talked about really training your staff to approach all students as if they have a potential history of adverse childhood experiences. Can you speak to how they sort of talk about those challenges without necessarily sharing personal details about students?
Well, you know, I agree with what Kara said as well. You know, we like to let our staff know that if a child is in a situation where they may, you know, have a higher score, a higher ACE score, and we don't necessarily have to tell them every detail. They just need to understand that this is a child who may be in crisis or had been in crisis, or a family who had been in crisis or was in transition. You know, those are some of the terms that we do use to help our teachers maybe get a better understanding of the students. But when we say we want to treat all students like they have ACEs, I think that's a general approach of kindness to students and to people, and to maybe just always step back and think before you are reactive to a student, and using our PBIS and, you know, the things that we've learned about positive behavior to promote positive behaviors out of students no matter what their background is. But if you think about, before you react, that, you know what, maybe this child does have something else going on, I better check myself before I start checking this student. And it's not about not having boundaries and consequences, but it's really just about a mindset of, you know, maybe stepping back and just thinking about why the student is doing what they're doing, you know, and not to take it personally, because it's probably not about you. It's more about them than it is about you.
Excellent, thank you. And I'm going to turn that last question over one more time to Jasenia. Is there anything in the Changing Minds campaign in particular that you would suggest folks lean on as they are thinking about really communicating with their colleagues about all students potentially having adverse childhood experiences and trauma responses at school?
Yeah, in the Changing Minds campaign in particular, we focus on thinking about the gestures as something that you implement with all children. So celebrating and comforting and listening and collaborating and inspiring all children is a part of the campaign, what we encourage in the campaign, especially because we, like Kara and Julie and Casey have all said, there's no way to know sometimes whether a child has specific traumatic experiences or what their ACE score is. And again, you know, as Kara and Julie have said, you don't necessarily have to share that information to know that these gestures are going to be effective for all children.
Thank you. I'm going to turn our next question over to Casey. Everyone, I think, but especially Casey, really focused on predictability and consistency as a key part of a trauma-informed environment. And individual educators tend to be really confident about that in their own classrooms. But what about consistency, predictability, routines beyond the spaces that they have direct control over?
Yeah, thanks. You know, I think about a school. We work with a principal in New York City, and they talk about the way that the staff greet the students as they come in the morning. They talk about at the beginning of the year how they actually have an app for parents, and they talk about how the parents absolutely know the expectations for them as well. It's predictable. The communications are regular and predictable. I saw somebody put in the group chat that I believe at their school they call a certain number of parents are called every week. It's just a thing that you do. So you build that into not only your classroom, but also into the school. And in talking with principals and superintendents, we find that when parents have buy-in and when you're communicating with them regularly and predictably, they reinforce that as well. They reinforce it at home, and they help the school raise their bar on creating those safe and supportive environments. So I think, but you know, we do the Leadership Institute with multidisciplinary teams because it is so much more than just that one individual teacher. That individual teacher can make an enormous impact, but it gets amplified when the whole school is on the same page and is using some of the same tools to support kids.
Awesome, thank you. I don't see any other questions coming in, so I'm going to do a few wrap-up suggestions and see if anything else trickles in our last few minutes. I want to remind all of our attendees that they have an opportunity to download a professional development certificate with the PD certificate widget on the left side of your screen, and you'll also need to take the survey that will show up right after we stop recording to make sure that you can get that. All right, not seeing any other questions coming in at this point, I want to give a robust thank you to our fantastic speakers and to everyone who is with us. If you were able to follow along on Twitter, thanks so much. And if you weren't, please check in and see what kind of summary we did there at #EDUPD. And encourage your colleagues to come back and check out this recording or this archive later. They can still get their certificate at that point. Have a great night, everyone.
Thank you.